So, whatever happened to the original King Kong? Let's find out. Movies,
music, and monsters.
Hey guys, Dan Monroe here, Media Master Design, where we talk about movies, music, and monsters. Just moved into my new studio space. Nice to be able to surround yourself finally with all the stuff you love so much that I can share with you guys. Amazing that the channel is almost at 10,000 subscribers. 10,000! We could almost buy our own ship for that. So once again, I'd like to thank all of you for that. Thank you. Today we are discussing the king of all the monsters, the one and only King Kong. No, not that one. Not that one. Definitely not that one. This one. Personally, as a kid, I loved King Kong because it was obvious to me that this was not a guy in a suit. This was a monster. King Kong was released by RKO Radio Pictures in 1933. It was directed by Marion C. Cooper and Ernest B. Schudesack, with an incredible musical score by the one and only Max Steiner. Now, Kong here himself was designed by Willis O'Brien, who was a special effects and stop-motion animator. He was responsible for such amazing stop-motion classics, early stuff like The Lost World in 1925 and Creation in 1931. But it would be his next project that changed cinema history forever. Marion C. Cooper was a documentary filmmaker, and he had an idea for a movie called Beast. Luckily, they ended up not going the route of a man in a monkey suit. Thank goodness for that. The Kong models were physically created and machined by Marcel Delgado, who was a very famous model maker at the time in Hollywood. Kong's head was cast in aluminum, and then, after the very elaborate armature was created, Kong was covered with pruned rabbit fur. In fact, if you look at the movie, anytime you see Kong pretty much anywhere, you can always see his fur does this bristling thing. Well, that's literally the fingerprints of the animators. When they would touch Kong to move him, his fur would move slightly. You can really notice it in the footage on the Empire State Building at the end of the movie, which kind of looks like the wind is blowing his fur. It's a cool effect. Some cool trivia. The iconic roar of Kong here was actually recordings of lions and tigers slowed down and reversed. The armature technology that was created by Willis O'Brien underneath all of the fur on Kong is exactly the same technology they use today for current animation. Jack the Giant Killer, Nightmare Before Christmas, exactly the same technology. Now, this Kong stuff can get a little bit confusing, but just bear with me, and I promise to make it as easy and painless as possible. They did make a number of different Kongs of different sizes for different points in the film, including an enormous life-size mechanical face, which I believe we saw 3 times. We saw originally in the jungle when he was rampaging the village and eating some of the villagers, and for the last time when he was in New York on stage. They made a giant mechanical hand that would reach out and grab Fay Ray, and they also made an enormous giant foot, once again used to stomp down the natives. It's kind of funny, years later when King Kong was being run on television, they would cut a lot of that stuff because they thought it was just too violent. All those shots of Kong's face munching on those people and squishing them down into the ground, those scenes were all cut for years and years. But luckily today, that footage has been restored. Anyway, although there were a whole bunch of different Kongs made, today we are going to focus on the 2 18-inch Kongs that were used for 99.9% of all the animation in the film. Now, the first of these 2 18-inch Kongs was actually a prototype. Marion C. Cooper shot a whole bunch of footage basically as test footage in order to get the movie sold. And this first 18-inch Kong is called Longface because he basically looks like he has a long face. Now, the footage that this particular Kong was in specifically was the Tyrannosaurus fight and the scene where Kong is shaking the sailors off the log. When the film finally got picked up and financed by RKO, they decided that they were going to make a second Kong, round face, 18 inches tall, same as the first one, so that they could have two different teams of animators animating Kong at the same time, doing different shots. All of the stuff in New York, all of the rest of the stuff in the jungle, that was round face. If you look at the two Kongs side by side, you can really see the difference between the two face structures. The long face Kong prototype is currently owned by Peter Jackson, Lord of the Rings fame, who eventually remade King Kong in 2005. At that time, everybody had assumed that the prototype just didn't exist anymore and that the only Kong in existence was the second Kong, the round face. Until around 2008, the prototype Kong, the long face, showed up at an auction in London. So Peter Jackson grabbed it. It's funny, even today when Peter Jackson talks about his Kong armature, nobody really knows where it came from. It just showed up at the auction. Lucky for him. Now, the second Kong, round face. This particular Kong stayed right at RKO until around 1962. The armature of this Kong had much more precise machining than the long face Kong prototype. It was also this Kong, the round face, that eventually became Son of Kong. They just stripped it down, put on new fur, and boom, there you go, Son of Kong. This round face Kong eventually ended up with legendary Hollywood collector Bob Burns. Peter Jackson got his from an auction. So how did Bob Burns get his? Well, there was an animator named Phil Kellison in the 70s and 80s who had heard that RKO had a bunch of animation armatures for sale. So he went through the boxes. One of them was Kong. In the early 1970s, Phil loaned his Kong armature to the Movie World Museum in California. And then when the museum went out of business, Kong kind of disappeared. Phil got on the phone with the guy who ran the museum, and the guy said, gee, I don't know, he might be lost. Here's some cool trivia. What do Kong and Robbie the Robot have in common? Well, they were both at the same Movie World Museum. And here is a cool story. Enter Bob Burns. Bob was a good friend of Phil's. So Bob Burns is in a car with Bill Malone, and they're both headed down to Movie World so that Bill Malone can buy Robbie the Robot. What a cool tie-in. Anyway, while they were there, Bob Burns said, "Where's Kong? Phil wants him back." And after a little digging around, there was a box in the corner, and guess what? There was Kong. Guess he wasn't so lost after all. So Bill Malone left with Robbie the Robot. Bob Burns left with King Kong. What a day! Bob finally returned Kong to Phil, the owner, and Phil was so appreciative, he just gave Kong to Bob Burns. And that's how Bob Burns ended up with the second Kong. The Smithsonian in D.C. found out that Bob Burns had King Kong. They constantly asked and begged Bob, could we please display your King Kong? But Bob didn't want to risk it, so every time he said no. Quite frankly, I can't blame him. And the people at the Smithsonian were not too happy. In fact, they went out and they got some orange-colored ape figure and actually claimed it was the original. Well, when Bob Burns heard about that, he went right on CBS television and called the Smithsonian out on them claiming that they had a real Kong when it was really a fake. Anyway, King Kong opened in New York City on March 2nd, 1933. The reviews for the film were fantastic. The movie was loved by both critics and audiences alike. In fact, King Kong is rated by Rotten Tomatoes as the greatest horror film of all time. So there you have it, the history of both of the 18-inch King Kong filming armatures. But now King Kong was a star, and 1933 was certainly not the last time we heard his name. We had Son of Kong in 1933, Mighty Joe Young, which was clearly inspired by Kong, Kong vs. Godzilla in 1962, King Kong Escapes in 1967, a remake in 1976, which had both its ups and downs, a bizarre movie in 1986 called King Kong Lives, which had very few ups, and then another complete remake in 2005 by Peter Jackson with a completely digital Kong. But that, my friends, is the topic of another video. I certainly hope you enjoyed this brief history of the King Kong filming miniatures, and if you like this kind of stuff, please like and subscribe, and please feel free to stop by anytime as we continue our conversation on movies, music, and monsters. Movies,
music, and monsters.
Danger, danger.